Awesome. We are recording. Welcome, everybody. My name is Amanda Rosengren, and I'm the assistant pastor at Church of the Redeemer. The screen that says Jay's iPad, Jay is our senior pastor joining us tonight. I'm thrilled to welcome those from our congregation as well as Life on the Vine, which is Juliet's congregation. There might be some other folks as well. I invited some of the Mosaic folks. I don't know if any of them are joining us, but if so, welcome to you. And we're going to be posting this recording. So welcome to anybody who's just stumbled across the recording. We're glad that you're with us in whatever fashion. So here's how it's going to go tonight. I'm going to introduce Juliet in a minute. I'm going to pray. I'm going to turn it over to her. And she's going to share 20 minutes or so, and she'll kind of give some background to that. And then Anthony Wang, who is over here in my computer, I don't know where he is in you. Anthony is a lay leader at Church of the Redeemer, and he can introduce himself. I'll just say he leads our community group ministry as well as serves on our vestry. He's from Southern California, like me. Is kind of marketing / epidemiologist by day, and has a lot of other things to offer as well. He also has a passion for racial reconciliation and has studied with some folks like Lisa Sharon Harper. You might know that name. So I'm really thrilled that Anthony is going to be doing the facilitating tonight, so I can just put myself on mute and listen. Let me give you a brief introduction to our guest tonight, Juliet Liu. Wait, I don't know how I've heard you go by Juliet Liu more than even Juliet Liu Wait, which is good because that's what I ended up calling you, so I don't feel so bad now. Juliet is somebody that I knew from seminary at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, although she graduated before me and was in charge of the chapel and the worship. I don't forget if your title was director or something like that. And now Juliet is the lead pastor at Life on the Vine, which is not far from Church of the Redeemer. And Juliet, you can correct me if there's a different official title. I know how these things go. I'm just thrilled to welcome Juliet and learn some from her experiences, her knowledge of history, and thrilled I'm just really thrilled. Someone who's a friend as well as who has a lot of expertise and experience to offer to us. So thank you, Juliet, for being here. Let me pray, and then we'll begin officially. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Father, we do thank you that you're with us in our little rooms, wherever we are. And that somehow, mysteriously, you're with us as we gather through our computers and our devices. That's a mystery to us. And even as it grows weary, we're thankful for times like this, that we can gather like this. So I pray, Holy Spirit, we invite you here. We invite you to be present with us in our homes, in the midst of whatever's going on in the background, whatever our days have held. We take time to welcome you into our hearts, into our minds, into this space together. And we pray that your will be done in and through us. Thank you for being with us. In your name we pray. Amen.
He gets in the heat.
So I just say things from here now? Okay. Thank you so much, Amanda. And my name's Juliet. We don't use the language of lead pastor at Life on the Vine. I'm just the pastor at Life on the Vine. It's really good to be with you tonight, and good to see some friendly faces. Actually, I know more of you than I thought I would. So Dr. Harris, you taught me Greek exegesis, so it's very exciting to see you here tonight. And Dr. Greener, also good, always good to see you as well. So thank you again for this opportunity. Amanda shared with me a little bit about the series that you guys have been doing as a church, learning from different siblings from different racial backgrounds. And I just find this really exciting. I don't know if many of you are aware of this, but not a lot of churches in the suburbs are engaging with the issues of racial justice. And so I just think it speaks volumes about you all as a church, that you are diving into this and eager to learn. And so I'm really just privileged to be here tonight, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm just going to launch into a brief presentation about Asian American history before Anthony and I kind of share some of our more personal stories. So I think it's helpful, just as we dive into what it is like to be an Asian American Christian, to have kind of a common foundation for even just what Asian American means and what the history of the Asian American population is in our nation. So let me share screen with you all. Give me a second here. Okay, everyone can see that?
Yes, we got it.
Okay, and then let me just arrange my windows here. Okay, so to start off, I just should first say, I am a Chinese and Vietnamese American born here in the United States. So my father's family was originally from China, then they fled communism in China in 1949 and lived in Taiwan for just a few years before they immigrated to Puerto Rico in the early 1960s. My mother grew up in Vietnam. She is Vietnamese until she was 18. Then she fled her native country as a war refugee in 1975, eventually immigrating with her family to Lafayette, Indiana. My sisters and I, like I said, were all born in the US. And I know that's kind of a complicated cultural background, that I'm both Chinese and Vietnamese, but also my father grew up in Puerto Rico. So there's that whole thing. We eat lots of like Puerto Rican food in my family, along with the Chinese food and Vietnamese food that my mother makes. But I'm just gonna trust that you guys can embrace the complexity of my cultural identity. So I just wanted to do sort of a brief cultural introduction to myself before we dive in. So who are Asian Americans in the US? Asian Americans consist of more than 34 ethnicities. There may be more varieties of Asian Americans than any other racial group. So Asian Americans are not all alike, far from it. We consist of 34 ethnicities, each with vastly different languages, different cultures, nationalities, different times of immigration to the US, and more. So Asian Americans are not a homogeneous group, we are a very diverse group. Proportionally, Asian Americans currently make up only about 5.7% of the US population. So we're not a very large minority group. If you compare us to other groups, Hispanic Americans are about 18.5% of the population. Black Americans are about 12.2%. Asians are only 5.7%. So we're not a very large minority group in the US. However, we are the fastest growing racial group in the United States. So our estimated population, at least according to the 2019 census information, is that we are at 18.9 million in the US, but the projection is that by we're past the 1900s. The projection is that by 2050, we will have surpassed 40.6 million, which would put us at about 9 or 10% of the population. So we are a small minority group, but we are a very fast growing minority group. The numbers here were just for my own curiosity and interest, so I share them with you just for fun. But if you look at the different states here, Illinois tracks pretty closely to the national average in terms of what percentage of our population is Asian American. So Illinois, 6% of the population is Asian American, which I thought was interesting. Now I grew up mostly in the state of Nebraska, and the Asian population there is currently at only 2%, which is a good deal lower than the national average. And that's in 2019. So I'm guessing that in the 1990s, as I was growing up, that percentage may have been even lower. And then Anthony, you are from California, yes?
I am, Los Angeles.
Los Angeles, yes. So in California, where Anthony is from, the Asian population is 15% of the state's population. So pretty far above the national average. And then I include Hawaii here because Hawaii is a special state in the US, the only state where Asian Americans actually make up the majority of the population at 57%. So as you can imagine, and we'll kind of touch on this a little bit later, I think, me and Anthony, but growing up in California is probably a little different of an experience than growing up as an Asian American in Nebraska, which is more of the experience that I will speak to. I also find this graphic informative in that you can visually compare the population of different Asian groups in the US. So up at the top, you have the highest population of Asian Americans are Chinese Americans in the 4 millions. And then it goes in decreasing order of population. So Chinese, Filipino Americans are next, Indian Americans are next. And then also included in this graphic, you can see in the green bar, what percentage of those populations identify as church attending Christians. So the green bars represent who identifies as church attending Christians. And I just like to see this visually because you can see how strong of an affiliation with Christianity there is in many of these groups. So Filipino Americans, 89% of Filipino Americans identify as Christians. And then Korean Americans as well, just a very strong association with Christianity. 71% of Korean Americans identify as church-going Christians. So the term Asian American originated back in 1968 at the University of California in Berkeley, where Berkeley grad students Yuji Ichioka and Emma G founded what they called the Asian American Political Alliance. And they formed it as a way to unite Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino American students on their campus. Now, before this term was coined, people of Asian descent in the US would generally not refer to themselves as Asian Americans. They would refer to themselves by their specific ethnic subgroup. So in the same way that I introduce myself as Chinese Vietnamese American, that's more the nomenclature that would have been used, Japanese American, Filipino American. If a broad term was applied to Asians as a group, it was often terms that carried a lot of racist or colonialist implications. So terms like Oriental or Mongoloid were often used in the broader US culture. But Asian Americans was a phrase that was created by Yuji Ichioka and Emma G. And I think this is important to note that the term Asian American was never meant to indicate that we are all the same. It was a way to come together in solidarity and to struggle for our collective freedom, but it was not meant to obliterate the culture and language differences, which are very real between our groups. So it is a helpful phrase. It is a way for us to come together, but it is not ever meant to say Asian Americans are all the same. All right, so next I kind of want to dive into a 5-minute overview of Asian American history. And the 5-minute is maybe fudging a minute here or there. So obviously, in 5 minutes, I'm not going to be able to cover everything. So we're just going to really be hitting some highlights that I think are important. I also just wanted to say, I am not a historian. So I know Amanda said that I bring a lot of expertise tonight, but I bring, I would say, lay expertise. As an Asian American, I have really, in the past 2 decades of my life, been much more interested in learning about Asian American history than I was in the first 2 decades of my life. And I have found it to be very educational, and it has bolstered a sense of who I am and where I've come from. The way I like to think about it is, if you walk in halfway through a meeting, what's the first thing you ask? You ask something like, what did I miss, right? What did I miss? Someone catch me up. And for many Asian Americans, we have entered the country, the majority of Asian Americans actually immigrated after 1975. There is a longer history of Asian Americans in this country, but the majority of the population immigrated after 1965. And so as we enter into this country, we need to ask the question, what did we miss? That's just good conversational practice, right? I also think white Americans need to do this, to learn the history of what has happened before, because, if you start the conversation halfway through the conversation, you can't jump right in without being informed about what's come, right? What's come before influences what comes next. And so really, I think all Americans should do the really good work of understanding what the history is that has happened before us. And I think it's also important for the church to do, because if we are supposed to embody a kingdom of righteousness here on this soil, then it's really helpful to know what's happened on this soil. So here we have a brief 5-minute overview of Asian American history. Okay, so we're going to start in the mid to late 1800s, the era of early immigration. So in the mid to late 1800s, after the Civil War and the emancipation of Black slaves, the US found itself in need of a new and cheap labor force. So in 1865, the Civil War ends, and the US experiences a labor shortage in the absence of Black slaves. Now, not wanting to hire freed Black men and women for work, Southern plantation owners begin to experiment with Chinese workers in the Southern US. Chinese laborers are appealing to them because to the former slave owners, Chinese workers are still racially distinct, and they view them as easier to control. And so what they do is, in the absence of Black slaves, is they begin to import Chinese workers from Cuba, where many Chinese workers were working on sugar plantations. At the same time, on the other side of the country, the Transcontinental Railroad is being built to connect the East and West coasts of America. So the railroad companies recruit Chinese workers and pay them only half the amount of white workers. They actually set up recruiting efforts in Canton, China, where there is some economic instability. There was a war between China and Britain. So there are a lot of Chinese who were out of work or who were hungry and going through poverty. So the railroad companies sets up recruiting efforts in Canton to invite Chinese laborers to come to work for cheap and to build the railroad. The completion of the railroad changes the nation, and it helps America become a major industrial power in the world. But despite having built this connecting line for the country, the Chinese are not credited for their work or granted citizenship. So we'll move on to what we'll call the Exclusion Era, which is the late 1800s or early 1900s. Anti-Asian xenophobia and violence heighten, leading to violence and discrimination being codified into law and national policy. So the prevailing theme for this era is that the Asian, which is largely Chinese at the time, but later Korean, Japanese, and Filipino population, they are blamed for economic hardships and disease outbreaks, like the plague in San Francisco in 1900. So that may sound a little familiar to you in that the Chinese population is being blamed for a disease outbreak. Now, even though none of this is true, anti-Asian hostility grows. The politicians of the time embrace the narrative that it's the Chinese fault because it was mostly due to mishandling by politicians. And the propaganda against Asians is created and distributed. And then as anti-Asian discrimination grows, it is then enshrined into laws and national policies. So I'm going to highlight just a few of those laws that we see coming and being signed into law at that time. So here's a few, and you can, I can't touch on all of these tonight, but you can research more on your own after tonight. I'll just focus on this. In 1854, the California Supreme Court rules that Asians cannot testify in courts against whites. And as you can imagine, this makes them very vulnerable to abuse, attack, and injustice. Some examples of anti-Asian discrimination being legalized into national policies, you really see in the immigration laws that begin to be formed at this time. So again, in the midst of economic hardship and public health emergencies, Asians continue to be scapegoated and blamed. So these laws intend to exclude them altogether from the country, even though at the time, they are only 0.002% of the population. So just a very, very tiny, tiny percentage of the population, but they are being blamed for economic downturn. They're being blamed for absence of jobs. They're being blamed for crop failure and disease outbreak. So in 1882, what happens is Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's signed by President Arthur, and the act bans Chinese workers from entering the country and excludes Chinese immigrants that are already here from American citizenship. Now, this is significant because this is the first law restricting immigration into the United States. It is what begins what we now think of as legal and illegal immigration. Before this, there was no illegal immigration, just you would come. So this is the first law that actively bans anyone from immigrating to the United States. And when you read the literature from that time, Congress and the American public support this act because they are concerned with maintaining the white racial purity in the US. So Congress votes on this in 1882, but they continue to approve this act every 10 years until 1943. So it starts all the way back in 1882, but it is approved every 10 years by our Congress until 1943. Then in 1924, the Chinese Exclusion Act is followed by the Asian Exclusion Act, which bans immigration from all other Asian countries as the West Coast begins to get nervous, not just about the Chinese population, but now the Japanese and Korean laborers as well. And the Asian Exclusion Act remains in place until 1965. So these are just a few examples of how the United States enshrined discrimination against Asians into laws and national policies. Some anti-Asian violence we see at the time. Again, remember that Asians are not allowed to testify in courts against whites, and we see mass lynchings and massacres of their people. The lynchings and murders happen with no one being held accountable by the law, as all white juries continue to find the murderers not guilty. So these are just a few examples. I'm not going to dive into them, but again, you can kind of jot down the names and read more about them later. So moving into the World War II era, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, America sees another rise of anti-Asian fear focused on Japanese Americans. So on February 19th, 1942, FDR signs Executive Order 9066, which authorizes over 120,000 Japanese Americans to be forcibly removed from their homes and imprisoned in internment camps. Now remember that immigration from Japan has been prohibited since 1924. So many of these Japanese Americans were born on US soil, meaning they had never even lived in Japan before. But the US views them again as an existential threat to themselves, as enemies, and so they round them up and put them in internment camps. Then as we move into post-war immigration, what happens is the United Nations is formed, and now under new global scrutiny, the US's laws are looked down on by the world. The US had acquired a reputation for only favoring immigration from Northwest Europe. And so under this global scrutiny, President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 into law. And what this act does is it does away with nation-based discrimination. So they do, the US does start receiving immigrants from Asia again, but it also introduces a priority system, a point system, or a filter, which only allows professionals with highly specialized skills and high levels of education into the country. And this priority system lets in people like engineers and scientists and doctors. This, at the time, it's strategic because the US is entering into a Cold War era with Russia, and they want more scientific technology in the US. So they let Asian immigrants in, but only immigrants who are scientists, doctors, engineers, and have highly specialized backgrounds. And we'll get to why that's important in a little bit. We'll move into the 1970s to today. In the 1970s, beginning around 1975, we get a new influx of a different kind of Asian immigration. So Southeast Asian refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos enter the United States fleeing war. My mother would have been one of those. Roughly 1 million Southeast Asians have entered the United States since then through a variety of refugee resettlement and immigration programs. Another thing I'll mention from that era is that in 1982, Chinese American Vincent Chin was beaten to death in Detroit, Michigan by 2 white men. At the time, Detroit was a powder keg of racial animosity toward Asian Americans. specifically because of the success of the Japanese auto industry and how it affected the US market. So despite the murder being witnessed by 2 off-duty policemen, the men are given no jail time and only fined $3,000 for their crime. The light sentencing sparks outrage, and it actually fuels another movement for Pan-Asian American rights. So this is an important moment in Asian American history where Asian Americans once again realize we need to come together for our collective freedom. And then today, we are seeing the rise again in anti-Asian violence. They say it has increased by 169% in the past year, largely due to anti-Asian hostility from the COVID-19 pandemic. So I guess I'll just pause here and ask, any thoughts or reactions to what you've heard so far?
I just really appreciate how you put the pieces together. John, I see that you want to talk too. I mean, I've heard these bits and pieces, but the narrative is just, it's shocking. And I'm both grateful for that and just shocked. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I find it painful to hear.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
It's not what you learn in school books. We're not taught this in school.
Juliet, I appreciate that. That's a painful history to go through so quickly. I was just texting a friend, and when I was I grew up in San Diego, and my best friend in high school was Meg Honda, and her mother died eventually of the TB that she caught in the internment camp. And so her parents met at Manzabar, and it's just such a painful, painful history. So thank you so much for just really giving that context. It's just essential. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, when we learn about these injustices, and we carry that shock and that sadness. So all of those find a place to be absorbed in our body. And so I'm going to just ask us to take a couple deep breaths right now. Breathe in, breathe out. Just do that a few times. All right, that sort of breathing work I found is just so important, for us to continue diving into really painful history like this. We need to know what to do with, that trauma or that sadness. It needs to go somewhere. So I just encourage you, as you're learning, to do, to stop from time to time and take some deep breaths. And I'm not done, so let me continue here. Okay, so another thing that I wanted to cover tonight is the myth of the model minority, which I think is so central to the Asian American experience in the US. So you're gonna have to remember some of the things I talked about regarding immigration, and let's kind of think about the 1960s and what is happening during that time. So in the 1960s, we have sort of the swelling movement of the civil rights movement. It begins in the 50s really, but it kind of really comes to a swell in the 1960s, and it is the Black struggle to end discrimination. At the same time then, in 1965, immigration laws change, right? LBJ signs the act that allows immigrants from China and Japan and Korea and mostly East Asian places to come in. But because it uses a filter or that point system, it's only highly skilled engineers, scientists, and doctors from East Asia mostly who are immigrating to America at that time. What happens then is we see the creation of what we call the model minority narrative. And the model minority narrative is something like this. Asians are hardworking, they're more intelligent, they're really good at math and science, and they are able to succeed and fulfill the American dream for themselves. And this talking point is created and taken up and spun by largely white politicians of the time who are pushing back against the Black civil rights movement. So consequently, Asian and Black Americans are pitted against one another. The purpose of the model minority narrative is not actually to celebrate Asians and to say, oh, how wonderful Asians are. The purpose of the model minority myth is actually to keep the Black community down and to call into question the legitimacy of the civil rights movement. So the model minority myth says, if Asians can succeed, what is the Black community whining about? Right? If Black Americans were as hardworking, as intelligent as Asian Americans, if they valued education the way Asian Americans did, if they had stronger family units the way Asian Americans do, if they were just more inherently intelligent, they would succeed. But instead, we see Black Americans saying America's racist, but we're not racist, just look at the Asians. So we see how the model minority myth is kind of driving this questioning of the civil rights movement, questioning its legitimacy, and trying to lift up Asians as the model minority, as an example of, look what can happen in America. Look how racist we are not, because look at this group thriving and growing. But it ends up being a very harmful narrative for a number of reasons. First, it completely ignores the role that selective recruitment of highly educated Asian immigrants has played in Asian American success. So, those immigration filters are only allowing the cream of the cream, the top of the top, to enter into the United States. So if you were to go back to Asia, not everyone there is a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or a scientist. But those were the only Asian immigrants that were being let in the 1965 era. So it's not a fair comparison, and it misrepresents the reality of how discrimination and many generations of economic inequity continues to affect the Black community. Second, it's harmful because it effectively erases the struggles of other Asian immigrant groups, particularly the ones who immigrate post-1970s due to war or instability in their homelands. And what that does is it puts pressure on all Asian Americans to achieve an intense standard of success when they may not have the same financial and educational resources that other Asian American students have. And it causes Asian Americans that are struggling with poverty to feel shame, like they are the only ones who are struggling, because supposedly all Asian Americans are succeeding and doing really well. It kind of erases stories like this. I'll show you this graphic. Poverty rates, especially among Southeast Asian Americans, is actually higher than the national average. So among the Hmong community, the poverty rate is 27.4%. But also among the Cambodian American, Vietnamese American, and Laotian American communities, the poverty rates in these communities is higher than the national average. But the model minority narrative erases these differences, and it erases the need for politicians to come up with public policy that will help these groups. It also ignores stories like this, that during the pandemic, Asian American women have had the highest jobless rates, and that Asian American food aid has had to expand during the pandemic to address hidden hunger. And then lastly, it is a harmful narrative because it silences the Asian community about their struggles in exchange for conditional acceptance and honorary whiteness. So the model minority myth is basically white America making a deal with Asian Americans and saying, if you do not point out what's wrong with our society, like the Black community is doing, and if you continue to attain a moderate level of success, not too much success because then we'll feel threatened by you, but if you continue to achieve a moderate level of success and you, again, don't point out what's wrong with us, then we will give you provisional acceptance or kind of honorary whiteness. And so it's a really harmful narrative to the Black community because it makes a false comparison between the communities. It's a harmful narrative because it erases the struggles of various Asian immigrant groups, which really there are true struggles with poverty among certain Asian American groups. And it silences us in exchange for honorary whiteness. So I guess in closing for this presentation, I just want to say, the rise in anti-Asian violence that we see today, it's not new, unfortunately. It's actually just another iteration of what has been the reality for Asian Americans for centuries. Asian Americans have been vilified and blamed for societal stress. And the story of Asian Americans, sadly, has largely been a story of exclusion. Our history is one of being excluded as America sought to preserve a white purity in the nation. In times of economic downturn, job shortage, crop failures, and public health emergencies, Asians were blamed and scapegoated. We have been commodified and exploited as cheap laborers and then turned into enemies and seen as threats because we were willing to work for those cheap wages. And so, as I said at the beginning, it's so important for us to know our history because it reveals for us, it makes it clearer how white supremacy operates. And as an Asian American, knowing this history compels me to labor in solidarity with my Black, Latino, and Native American siblings who have also been commodified, exploited, eradicated, and excluded. And the church, I think, needs to know this history if we are to embody a kingdom of righteousness on the soil of this nation. We need to reckon with what has happened here on this soil and how we have actually been shaped by it as a church.
Well, thank you, Professor Liu, on shining a light on really the hidden, overlooked history of Asian Americans. I think you've really illustrated how this experience and discrimination against Asian Americans and how intertwined it is with other minoritized people, right, in America. Race in America is so complex. So, thank you for doing that. And I want to thank everyone here tonight who've continued to engage on this topic, despite how difficult it is at Redeemer and Life on the Vine as well, too. That was a lot of really hard stuff. It's truth and it's hard, Juliet. I think sometimes when we work in the space of racial reconciliation, it can be very discouraging, as much as we pour ourselves into, like, this is when things get better, right? So I think it's important for us to be reminded that reconciliation comes from God, right? And you've been working this for a long time and you have passion for it. So I'm wondering, what is your vision for a racially reconciled Christian community that you'd like your Asian American kids to grow up in?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anthony. Well, one, I think this is just, this is work that we do and we just keep doing as a church. My vision for a racially reconciled church is that doesn't happen until Revelation. Until that vision, and until then we are racial reconciling, right? So we will not be the racially reconciled church until Revelation. But that's true about any sin that we struggle against. We will not be completely free of any one of the sins that we struggle with as humanity until Christ comes again and salvation is made full. But that doesn't mean that we don't labor because of it's more because of the people that we are becoming as we engage in this work. So I think that's part of my vision for my children for racial reconciliation, is that the hope that feeds them is maybe not even rooted in, like, because one way we'll get, one day we'll get there, we'll somehow make it to the finish line. I think Jesus gets us to the finish line, but our hope is that we are becoming a certain kind of people just by engaging in this work. And whether we make progress or not, the alternative is becoming the kind of people who don't do that work, right? The kind of people who say, well, it's just too bad, but this is how it is. And I think Christ has a different vision for the kind of people that he wants us to be. So that's part of my vision. Do you, I feel like I've talked for a long time. So what about you?
I think what you bring up is, I just totally agree with, and, I think of Eli, I think of Eli and a community that he'll grow up in at Redeemer or even at school, and just a community that really engages and loves and cares about and wants to know our stories. I feel like that's such an important part of what it means to be reconciled is relationship. We can have all this knowledge, but if we don't do the work of relationships and being with each other and advocating for each other, standing in solidarity with each other, then what is it for, really? So yeah, and I think it's so hard, Juliet. I know, it's like it's never easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's messy and it's difficult. So I just again want to commend everyone in our communities, and both at Redeemer and at Life on the Vine, for continuing to work.
Yeah. I think, another thing I would add, Anthony, is, for my kids, I really want this to be just so integral to how they see Jesus and what they see him doing in the Gospels. So I want their work of justice and liberation to be tied to, because this is who Jesus is, and I think reading the gospel through that lens, like, you begin to see so much more and more, like, how every time Jesus is going after those on the margins, the ones that are left out, the ones who are, the poor, the women, the sick. And so I want their love for Jesus to be tied to their love for justice. And that's always what I hope for and long for my church as well.
Seek justice. I think it's a good thing to work towards. Thanks for sharing that, Juliet. I really appreciate you sharing just even the demographics, right? Asian Americans are not a homogenous group and not distributed evenly across America. How we grew up, right, in America is very different.
Yeah.
I grew up with a lot of Asians. Like, you go to UCLA, it's just everyone has black hair. UCI, right? University of Chinese Immigrants. Just kidding, but that's a moniker, right? Like, it's just like that. Like that, it's just something that we poke fun at because there's so many Asian people in Southern California, right? So kind of how I grew up was, I always felt I belonged, right, to like a church or to my group of friends. And interestingly, even in California, it's diverse, but it's still very racially segregated. In high school, all of my friends were Asian. And I know one of the things that you're really passionate about, Juliet, is gender stereotypes, right? And how that impacts Asian Americans, impacts Asian women, and also impacts Asian men. So while growing up, I never faced blatant racism, but I was impacted by the stereotypes against Asian men, right? I think that in media, especially, Asian men are portrayed as very effeminate, asexual, homosexual, right? It's Asian men are not desirable, as in American society, and that's kind of something that I really had to deal with, like in LA, in California, for Asian man to date a non-Asian woman would be like, oh my gosh, what happened? Like, I can't believe what are they seeing you? That's crazy. So I was very fortunate for Alana to rescue me from a life of singleness. So thank you, Alana. But that really does shape your identity or your self-worth, growing in that environment. So I want to ask you, Juliet, growing up in the Midwest is very different. So how was it like growing up as a Chinese Vietnamese American woman in the Midwest?
Yeah, it was rough. So you can probably guess, just seeing that percentage, that 2% of the Nebraskan population was Asian American, and I'm guessing in my time it was more like 1% maybe. It was just the norm for me growing up to always be the only Asian person in the room. Or even like the only Asian person at my school, although I had sisters, so sometimes they were the other Asian person at my school. But, in my high school of 1,200 students, I knew all the Asian kids. There were probably about 6 of us out of 1,200. You mentioned like, being on campus in California and it's like everyone's got black hair. Well, in Nebraska, everyone has blonde hair. So there's a high history of German immigration to Nebraska and Omaha in particular. And so everyone at my school was blonde haired and blue eyed. So it wasn't even like I was like in a sea of like brunette people. It was like I was in a sea of like blonde haired, blue eyed people. That just was the norm. And so, I grew up just being very, very aware of how different I was. And that's true. We all go through that stage where we feel like we stick out so much. But that was just my life, even before adolescence and after. I think too, there's a way that as a child, you have to interpret your differentness. So you encounter your differentness over and over again. I encountered my differentness over and over. I'm going to try not to disassociate and just, stay in my story here. But, I encountered again and again that I was different, whether it was like my social studies teacher asking me questions about China when we got to that unit, and me being like I was born here. Like, I don't know the answer to that question. But sort of that realization of like, oh, because when she sees me, she doesn't see an American, like she sees someone who's foreign. So that, just things like that were always sort of jarred me back into the reality of everyone sees me as different. And then I had to interpret that as a child. And how like kids from divorced families, because of your developmental stage, you interpret everything in a self-centered way. So children of divorce they assume it's my fault, like I did something to deserve this. Well, in the same way, I think that's how I interpreted my differentness as a child. It was like, I'm strange. I must be treated this way because I'm inferior. People must have trouble making eye contact with me because I look bad, or I am bad, or, the kids on the playground must make fun of me and make fake Chinese language noises and call me racial slurs because there's something wrong with who I am. And so that was just a normal thing for us to carry around as Asian Americans, not having a strong Asian community around us. We just assumed like, well, yeah, something's wrong with us. We're not white. We're kind of cursed. Like, blessed are the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and cursed are the brown-skinned, black-haired, slanty-eyed people. So that was just the assumption that we made as we interpreted our differentness.
Yeah. What did it feel like to be so isolated? How did it impact? Like, how did it really impact how you saw yourself? I know you mentioned that not having, you felt like people like thought you were bad. I mean, did you internalize that, and how deeply did you internalize that? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. I mean, there's deep internalization of that even at 40 years old, I'm still having to be renewed from. So we had very little Asian community around us. It meant that, again, for me, I accepted that white American was the norm and it was preferable, and that whatever my family did was backwards, or whatever my family did was strange. One of the losses of growing up in a place where there's not a huge Asian community, I mean, let alone like specifically like a Chinese community or a Vietnamese community, is that we lost, my family lost a lot of our cultural traditions and practices. Because many cultural traditions and practices depend on like a community preparing for them together, right? Like holidays are like that. So like Chinese New Year, the women in the community get together and they prepare the food together, and they're in the kitchen all day. And then, there are decorations that are put up outside. But if you are a single unit family trying to sustain those practices in the middle of white America, you just eventually let them go because it's too much work. And also, I think my parents thought they were supposed to let that go. Like they kind of assumed our job is to assimilate and to make ourselves like the surrounding community. And so sometimes we would kind of try to maintain some cultural practices, but a lot of the time, it was just too difficult to do that. And so that's something I grieve, is that a lot of my family's culture and tradition has been lost because we lacked the structure of a community to kind of help retain those.
Mm-hmm.
And without those, then it's kind of hard to have a sense of like cultural pride, or a sense of like, yeah, like it's so great being Chinese American, it's so great being Vietnamese American, because you don't have a lot to point at, except for like, my parents expect really high things of me because they feel the pressure of us succeeding. They're like, you guys, every day, they're like, you guys have to do better than everyone else. Like you're not going to be afforded the privilege of like just phoning things in. You got to work harder. You got to do better. You got to be the best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the immigrant story. And I mean, even this is a story of a lot of other minorities as well too, right? Like I talk to my Black friends, and they're always taught that like I have to work 3 times harder just to be equal, to be considered equal to everyone else. A women the same way, right? It's just it's difficult.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. I want to talk a little bit more about like the model minority, the myth of the model minority. And this is something that I have benefited from, growing up, being, afforded opportunities, like that others might not have. Because my parents emigrated in the late 70s, right? Because my dad was an engineer, so we kind of lived into that myth of the model minority. And throughout my life, really, there hasn't really been an external shock against the Asian community until like recently, last 5 years or so, right? And to me, that was actually a really big shock, because with the trade war tensions, right, with China, the narrative around China is like, oh, if you're Chinese, you're the bad guy. You are causing our, disproportionate trade deals or whatever, and causing us our economic woes, here in America, right? And I feel like that has really impacted me, because I, for the first time in my life, I felt like I don't belong in this country. This is where I was born here,
Yeah.
And just dealing with that I had to grieve through it, we drove through Texas to see our friends, and driving by so many Confederate flags, it just, I don't feel safe, and by that point, there wasn't like as huge of a spike in violence against Asians at that point, but with COVID, there's more and more of that violence against Asians. And when I talk about violence against Asians, it's not just verbal assaults, because there are a lot of verbal assaults, and it's very damaging, but there were like two elderly women in San Francisco that were stabbed. There was like that Filipino man in Brooklyn, and that was attacked with a box cutter, cut across from ear to ear. No one helped him, right? There's and it's not just elderly people, right? There was like a 20-year-old man, like in John Wynn, right, in Washington, who was stabbed to death outside his apartment. I mean, this is happened in broad daylight. And what it feels different is that, look, it's not just violence committed by white folk, right? It's committed by people from all ethnicities. That elderly woman, Asian woman that was walking to church, got punched in the face by a Black guy, kicked on the ground. Thankfully she survived and is okay. But I think that just furthers the otherness, right, of that Asians are made to feel. And that's been really hard. I mean, honestly, like I don't feel safe. Like I had never felt this before in America. And how have you processed this increase in violence against Asian Americans?
Yeah. Whew. Well, I mean, it's been hard, and I think, for me, I know we talked a little bit about this, before tonight. I know Anthony and I touched base a little bit, and for me, the past 5 years, wasn't as much of a shock. I mean, there was definitely an increase in rhetoric, hostile rhetoric and things like that, that was not comfortable or was not welcome. But it was also, for me, it was like, yeah, like that kind of hostility I've experienced. The rise in actual, like, physical violence has been very disturbing. And, as a parent, I've had to learn how to talk to my children about it. I have my older son is 13. He's an NPR junkie. So he's, it's very hard to hide things from him that are happening in the nation because he hears it before I do. And so, we have to talk a lot about this and, kind of help my kids think through in developmentally appropriate ways. Like, if we were to go out and someone were to start yelling at us, or, someone were to be aggressive, like, what do we do? And those are not conversations you want to have with your children, but they feel necessary. And it's really, I think for them, it's made the pandemic just 5 times heavier. I mean, the pandemic is heavy for all children, but I think, the extra burden that they carry trying to think through what it means for them to be Asian American and to look the way that they do and to be seen by people as different, it's made their heaviness even heavier. So I try to process that kind of fear with them. And, I've had to, kind of mentally prepare myself for, if I'm out in public, especially with my children, and am being yelled at, like, what is my response going to be? And what do I want my children to see me do if that happens? So my natural instinct is they say fight, flight, or freeze. I'm generally freeze or flight. I'm not really a fighter, but I kind of, made a decision early on to be like, I don't want my children to see me running from that. I will fight. So I have, a plan in mind for, like, what I will say and do if I experience that kind of hostility. And I'm very thankful that we have not experienced that here.
I mean, I think that it's striking because a lot of times when I tell people, hey, I'm afraid, like, when I go out, like, what am I going to do? Like, and when I'm in a situation like cornered, like, I fight, and I think that, like, and to me, a question is like, well, is that the right thing? Is that going to escalate, or how do you de-escalate? And Jill, I know that was it June 5th? You'll have like a class, right? You're hosting a class on to do in those situations. I think that's really important. I think we'll have to trade notes, as and as I tell people this, I think people are genuinely surprised. They're like, what, really? You don't feel comfortable outside, is that really, and it's a new reality for me, honestly. Yeah. And I've been talking to Eli about that. I'm still figuring that out. So
yeah.
So let's trade notes.
One thing I'll say is that I think part of what's very difficult for myself and for other Asian American friends I have is that it feels like, even though it's very present in our minds, the fear and the what ifs, that it doesn't feel like when we talk to our white friends that there's a real recognition of what's happening.
It's true.
And so, one of the worst experiences when you are afraid is encountering someone who doesn't take you seriously, right? We all know, like, the pain of that, right? Like, when you are afraid and you are vulnerable and you reach out to someone and what they do is they ridicule you, or they ignore you, or they don't even seem to hear you, that just adds to the trauma of the experience. And I think I would say that, what I and other Asian Americans are experiencing right now is that's part of the trauma for us, is that not only are these, instances growing, but it doesn't feel like our white friends have really responded or said very much or acknowledged that our fear is real. And so that's also that's just part of the experience, I think, that we need to name.
Yeah, no, totally true. Juliet, you are you are a leader in this, talking about what to do, right? Like you're a leader in this movement nationally, right? In at least voicing from your experience as an Asian woman, what is that like, right? And also your leadership in educating other people, but also building solidarity with other minority groups. So I'm just really curious to see like, what is your experience as an Asian American woman in a Christian context, in Christian community? What is that like? Is it similar? Is it different? We talked a little bit about it, but yeah, can you tell us more?
Yeah. So I'll start early. So I grew up, there was a small Chinese church in Omaha that my family attended. And, we were a very small community. We often had to invite professors from the local Christian college to come and fill in and do some teaching and preaching for us. My experience with them was that we were not treated as equals in the church. So we were viewed as their mission field, which, they're not evil for doing, I'm not saying they were like evil people because they saw us as their mission field, but it was very clear that we were not on equal footing with them, that they kind of came and bequeathed their knowledge on us. But they were kind of like, well, their assumption was the gospel isn't here, we're bringing it to you. Even though like we were a church, like we were a Chinese Christian church. So we knew the gospel, we read the Bible, but their kind of understanding was like, oh, let us minister to you and correct you in the things that you have wrong. And so, they carried a pretty paternalistic attitude toward us. It was, benevolent paternalism, but it was still just unequal. So that was sort of my experience with, my first experience with like being an Asian Christian and interacting with white church leaders and professors. And then, I would say that theme probably carries on. Like, I think that what I have encountered in the mostly white church space is like our view of scripture and our theology is the correct one. And every other theology is a syncretism or an unfaithfulness. So, I would say even, I'd say that's, that accusation is one I carry with me as a current pastor and preacher. So I do fear, at my church, like, do people view my preaching and my theology as like, well, of course, Juliet sees it that way because she's like a woman of color, but like, that's just kind of her slant on things. Or am I, is my voice and perspective welcomed as like equally legitimate? And so, my experience has been that a lot of white Christians don't understand that their theology is also contextualized, that it is a white theology, it is an American theology. But they are very quick to say that my theology is contextualized at best, but maybe a little questionable because of my social context.
Yeah, no, that's it. That is fascinating because oftentimes we say like, well, people think that, look, you should just be confident in who you are, and who God made you to be, right? But then I think we forget that when we're in a community, part of our identity and how we see ourselves is impacted by other people's perception of us, So I think I think that really underscores a point that within our community, we all have responsibility to care and love for each other and speak truth to who you are as an Asian American woman, to who I am as an Asian American man, to Amanda, who's like a Danish,
Danish, German, mixed woman,
Riverside, California woman, and I think that calling to give to each other, right, and to love each other, it's so important, and it's not just the work of white people, Black people, Asian people. It's all of us, right?
Right.
So
I would say,
yeah,
right.
go ahead, please.
Oh, I just sort of wanted to add to that, like, one thing I want to name, about being an Asian American Christian woman is that the challenge that I face is that I don't quite fit into all white churches. But I also, as a female who has felt for decades sort of a calling to preach and to lead, have not fit well into the Asian church either. So I think Asian American Christian women who are called into leadership and ministry face this double, like, from whiteness, they hear the message of like, don't speak up, like that's not your job. And then also from their Asian culture, they hear that message of like, don't say anything, like that's not your job. And so the church for me has been a place where I've had to encounter those voices from lots of different angles, and then try to hear the voice of the Spirit in the midst of all of those countering voices.
That's so lonely, right, to be in that place. I'm curious, like, are there Bible passages or scriptures that really keep you going and really speak to you, that God really uses, that you come back to when you're in that time of a really lonely place of not feeling where you fit in? How does God speak to you through the scriptures?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Harris. My favorite passages are just always the passages where God uses someone unexpected, like just someone who is on the outside. Also, one passage that I just, especially in recent months, have started to really love is like the passage with Moses arguing with God. So much, because I have just my whole life been surrounded by these voices that are like, don't talk, stay small, don't take up space, but have also wrestled with like a calling to ministry. I am just in a continual state of like self-doubt and fear about like, well, I don't know, like, is this what God wants me to do? And so, that passage of Moses and Yahweh being like, hey, you, Moses, and Moses being like, me, like that whole like three-way, the three-part conversation where Moses keeps saying no, like, you've got it wrong, it's not me, there's got to be someone else. And the Lord's like, yeah, you Moses, I'm calling you out here. I really just love that passage. And what gives me a lot of hope is that at the end of that passage, Moses finally obeys and he listens to the Lord and he's sent to the people of God. He gets to tell them, the Lord has heard your cries and he has sent a deliverer and he cares about you. And then the people fall on their faces in worship. So I love that story because Moses is like wrestling with self-doubt and he's like, no, there's got to be someone else. There's got to be someone else. And then when he finally obeys God, it's not just about him, Moses, it's about the whole people of God getting to hear the good news that God has heard their suffering and he cares about them. And that's like a really beautiful story to me that gives me hope. Like when I'm wrestling with self-doubt, when I'm hearing those voices of like, this place isn't for you, you're not called to this, I remember that like, this is not about me. It is a little bit about me, but it's about like the people of God hearing the good news.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I know, right? I can say for certain that God is using you in so many amazing ways, and just want to affirm that in you. And just hearing you talk, hearing you in different settings on this topic of racial reconciliation from an Asian American perspective it's really encouraging. And just thank you for your work. I know we're going to put together a list of resources after our session, so you can listen to Juliet speak, Christianity Today, or what was that summit, right, with the what was that summit that you spoke with?
The one on Christianity Today, or
No,
the
not the other one. but
Solidarity
yeah.
event?
Yep, Solidarity event.
Yeah. A few weeks ago, down at Apostolic Faith Church in Chicago, which is a giant African-American church in the south side of the city, we brought together a panel of Asian American pastors and Black pastors in Chicago. And we just talked about like the commonality of experience between the Black community and the Asian American community, and how like we need to partner together. Because like I said, really since the beginning of Chinese immigration, where, in the US, they were like, oh no, we don't have any more slaves. What are we gonna do? I know, like, instead of just hiring and paying Black workers to do the work, because we don't want to pay them, like, let's get other people, let's bring in Chinese workers. So like really since the beginning, our communities have been pitted against each other, and the model minority myth has only furthered that. And so it's so crucial right now that our communities build solidarity and understanding with one another so that we can stop that cycle of being in competition with each other. And you mentioned, like some of the violence that we've seen towards Asian Americans this past year, some of it has come from the Black community. And I think because we carry those stories within us of like, you guys are the enemy, and it's like, it's either you at the bottom or it's me at the bottom. So I prefer for it to be you. And so we need to kind of stop that interaction and build solidarity and support one another as communities.
Yeah, and I think thank you for sharing that. That was such an amazing event. So make sure to check that out when we send that link out. I think that's talking about solidarity is a great segue into our first question of the night, right? So what can non-Asian folks do to better love and stand in solidarity with Asian Americans?
Yeah, first of all, you should send them cookies.
What's your favorite cookie, Julie?
The kind I can eat. That's only half of a joke. I think, if you have Asian friends, like meal sharing is so important to us. That was going to be my other answer for like what scripture passages mean a lot to me is anytime there's like a feast, I'm like, I'm there for it, like Isaiah 25, where a feast of rich food, like those passages really resound with me as an Asian American, because you all know we like our food. Ain't no potluck party like an Asian potluck party, because an Asian potluck party don't stop. And the food is so amazing. But share meals with your Asian friends. I would also say, the big thing is educate yourself. And I love that you guys are sending out resources after this, because there are so many resources now. Like when I was a kid, it was really hard to get your hands on something that probably wasn't really academic about the Asian American experience. But now, like literally just Google the Asian American experience and read a Wikipedia article on it. But there's also like PBS, the PBS documentary series, Opening the Gates to Asia by Jane Hong is a more academic book if you want a more deep history of Asian America. Minor Feelings by Kathy Hong, Big Little Man by Al Tizone. Have you read that, Anthony?
Mm.
So, some of the stuff he shared about stereotypes against Asian American men, he really dives into in a really personal way. So it's called Big Little Man. He's a Filipino American.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really good. There are podcasts now on Asian American history. And then I think we've sort of touched on this, but be willing to grieve and lament with your Asian friends, and recognize the hostility and violence that is happening. Because again, I think it's, we are experiencing this trauma from the increase in violence, but the trauma is compounded by feeling like it's invisible or unacknowledged. So, don't ignore it with your friends, like affirm that you see it, reach out to them. When you hear about an instance, reach out to them. And that's good for you too. Like that's good for you to have a way to channel, the sadness that you feel by reaching out to someone and just saying, hey, I'm with you. I'm hearing these stories and they're really troubling. And I'm so sorry that this is what's going on right now. Try not to say, I can't believe this is happening because it just sort of like, it sort of negates that like, this is not happening in a vacuum. Like this is, again, this is like another iteration of what we have seen in America for centuries. And then another thing I want to say is advocate and support policies that will help our community. So one big thing coming up is that the TEACH Act will amend the Illinois School Code to include Asian American history curriculum in public schools. So it has been voted on and passed by the House in Illinois, but it is going to the Senate sometime this year who will vote on it. So, you know, just call your politician and say, I support the TEACH Act.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Juliet. I'm going to share a story from today, actually, about how how I've experienced solidarity with a Black friend at work. So as I'm telling the story, we're going to open up the time the next 10 minutes or so for anyone else who has questions. So why don't you type in your questions in the chat, and then we'll pick some for Juliet to answer. Yeah, so today I got a text from my friend, and he texted me. He's like, Anthony, did you attend this sales call, national call? And I was like, I did, but I had another meeting, so I was late. I only caught the last half of it. And he's like, oh, okay. Because at the beginning of the sales meeting, they played a song. They played Kung Fu Fighting, you know, like, everyone was Kung Fu fighting, ding, 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 ding. He's like, I'm sure they didn't mean that, but with just like with all these like Asian tropes and stuff, and like the Kung Flu and all this, you know, like discrimination against Asians, that was really insensitive. And he's like that wasn't cool. And I just want to make sure that like you heard that, you know, that like, you know, I'm gonna back you up here. And I was like, yeah, I mean, you know, I wasn't there, so it'd be weird for me to like send an email to the organizers of the meeting. I was like, would you be comfortable sending an email to the organizers? And he's like, I rewrote an email. It's going to be sent right now. It's just really inappropriate. And, you know, I stand in solidarity with you. You know, so it's what you talked about, right? Like if you see something, say something, you know, like if you see someone being discriminated against or right. Or if your Asian friend, you know, tells you a story about how they feel, like, you know, whatever experience, you don't have to like have the right answers to say always. Sometimes just listen and being with
I think that's really good. And, you know, I'll add that I think personally and historically, the church in America has not always taken, you know, like when Asian Americans have come forward and said, hey, like, you know, this curriculum that you're publishing, or this book that you're publishing, it's actually like really hurtful to the Asian American community, and it's operating off of stereotypes. There's been a lot of defensiveness from Christian publishers and Christian churches. And I think on a more personal level, interpersonal level too, like it's hard to have an Asian friend say, hey, like that joke you just made or that thing you just said was like kind of offensive. And I think as Christians, we more than any other people need to have the character to know how to say, all right, I'm gonna listen to what you have to offer and consider that maybe there's a way for me to be corrected here, or there's something I need to listen to here. Unfortunately, I think some Christians I know are the most defensive people I know when it comes to that. But I think, you know, we need to cultivate the kind of Christ-like character that's humble enough to receive that truth. As the wonderful Brene Brown says, the truth will kick your butt, but then it will set you free. And I think that we need to be the kind of people who are open to hearing truth about ourselves, open to having our butts kicked, and then open to being set free by that truth.
Word. Does anyone have any other questions for Juliet or myself? I don't see anything in the chat, so feel free to type in questions if you have some. Amanda, do you have a question?
I always have questions, but Suzanne just added one in the chat.
How can we be intentional to support the Asian American children in our churches?
Wonderful question, Suzanne. Yeah, I think first, we need to not be afraid of talking about race or or bringing up ways that there are, racial differences in our youth groups or Sunday school classes or things like that. Because by not talking about it, we are saying something. And so, I mean, I can guarantee you, like, my sons aren't unaware that they're different. They're very aware of it. And so if they go to, a church that doesn't talk about it, then I think they're hearing a message in that like, oh, we don't talk about this. So I think one is just, we need to have the courage to just even talk about our differences and not see that as a bad thing. I think too, the stories that we use and the people that we lift up, it's so important that they be diverse. Like if we're only ever talking about, white male examples, then that communicates something too about who we see as being sort of the ideal human beings and the ideal Christians. Yeah, that's what I guess that's what I've got for now. But I'll keep thinking about that.
Great.
Susan's our youth pastor.
Awesome. Anyone else have a question? Amanda, I think you have an opening if you want to ask one.
I do. I'm thinking a lot about the idea of resilience, because I think pressing into this work is so hard, and leading it is hard. And you've been doing both for quite a long time now. I mean, relatively speaking, I think. How have you practiced resilience, ability to kind of get up and keep going? Again, I'm thinking a lot about you as a woman in ministry in a fairly evangelical setting, which is already hard, then a woman of color who's trying to press into race, and now you're not even a co-pastor anymore. You don't have someone else to lean on. So just what are your practices of resilience? I know, yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Oh, that's a great question. Oh, such a convicting question, Amanda.
Well, I'm asking because I need to know, Juliet. I'm trying to figure it out.
Well, I'm also figuring it out. I think that I am realizing now more than ever how much support I need. I have been, more purposeful in this past year in finding places where, as an Asian American woman, I can turn the filter off and just, and share things in a way that I know, like, I won't have to over explain. And I think that's difficult. If you imagine, like, when you're in a room full of male Christian leaders and you're trying to share with them, like, your experience as a woman, like, you're having to tell your own story and hear it through their ears. And so you're, choosing your words, and there's so much carefulness that goes into that. And so I know I need to have spaces, groups where I can turn off the filter, and where I know I can say, like, a phrase and they're like, yeah. They're like, yeah, got it. I totally understand. And so for me, most of those spaces have actually been virtual, like virtual groups that I'm a part of. There's a couple of women I meet with once a month to just pray for each other. One of them is a Korean American pastor. One of them is an African American pastor. But I didn't used to have those spaces, and now I'm more actively seeking them out. And then like what I mentioned even before, doing some of that body work of recognizing, like, I am, like, even recognizing, like, I'm telling my story, but I'm disassociating from it, or I'm researching this injustice more and more, and I'm suddenly, like, flooded physically, like my body is so tense and I can't breathe. So it's like noticing physically how we're carrying the grief, how we're carrying the tension and the anxiety and the fear, and learning, one, when to stop. Like, we need to give ourselves permission to take a break, and to set it aside. It doesn't mean that we're getting rid of it, but, like, you can put something on the shelf for later and you can still see it there, but and know you're going to come back to it. But right now you need to like breathe, you need to reconnect with your body, you need to rest, you need to do something restorative, and then you can go back to it. So I think part of the work we're doing as a congregation is learning how to lament and grieve together. And sometimes I'm still learning how to ask that of my congregation without like traumatizing them all the time, because it is traumatic to continue to dive into the atrocities and the violence and the injustice. And so we got to learn how to like, let's stop. And let's rest, let's breathe before we go back into it.
Yeah. Thank you, Juliet. So if you have other questions, you know where to find me and you know where to find Juliet, right? So with that, I know
now people know where to find me.
We're coming up to the top of the hour, so I don't wanted to just start wrapping things up here. I just want to say thank you so much, Juliet, for being a guest and joining us and sharing just about your story and about just the history of Asian Americans in America. Thank you for blessing us in this way. Amanda, do you have any last things you want to say?
Again, just want to highlight, Juliet has offered for us to kind of participate with us at Redeemer to participate with Life on the Vine for the bystander intervention training. If you see someone who's Asian American being harassed or threatened, what do you do? Instead of, freeze or flee or like fisticuffs, like what do you do? So that's on June 5th, and we'll get some information out for that. But other than that, the other thing I want to say, and just this is a conversation that I tried to arrange last fall. I reached out to a couple of professors who weren't available, and I'm really glad they weren't, because I'm really grateful, Juliet, that you were able to share with us. And in this time, I don't know. I'm just grateful. I'm grateful for this time and for you and your work. I want to say to all of us here that just to recognize what a privilege it is to have sat here and listened to these folks share so vulnerably about painful things and hard things. I want to honor that, and I ask that we all honor that and seek to receive it and let the Spirit do its work, do His work in our lives. So I'm going to pray, and then we'll be on our way.
I just want to say too, there's a couple questions that were asked, and I can hang on for a few more minutes after the
okay,
prayer.
great.
Chat. Yeah,
we'll do that, because I liked those questions too, and I'm curious. So let me pray, and then we'll officially end, and we'll have an after party. Okay, Father, the things that break our hearts break your heart so much more. And yet your love for us is greater still. And the grace that's available for us is greater still. Jesus, I thank you for how much you love Juliet and Anthony, that they're made in your image, that we are made in your image. We lament the ways in which that has not been honored in our country, in our churches, perhaps in our own lives. Help us do different. Help us be more like you. Help us turn toward you so that we might be saved. Holy Spirit, we give thanks. We honor this time. We thank you for Juliet and Anthony and for their families and all who they represent. And we pray that you'd continue to do your work in our midst. We praise you, and in your name we pray. Amen.
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 Thank you all. All
right. Oh, great. For those of you who are leaving, see you later. Juliet, I'd love to hear your answers here.
thanks for coming, everyone. And again, blessings on you as you continue this learning and this journey. I'm just so encouraged to know how you've been diving into this work, and I'm grateful for Amanda and the work that she's done to pioneer some of this at Redeemer. So Heather asks, are there things that white members of the church do or can do that signal to you an openness to hearing about the fear, anger, and fatigue? that's a great question. And I think, I think some of the stuff I've said applies. Like, I think, reaching out and just saying, like, this is still on my radar, and continuing to grieve. Beyond that first, like, like the week of the Atlanta shootings was just a terrible week. I know all of us, I don't know anyone who wasn't just deeply disturbed by that. But I felt the pain that the Black community often feels, where something happens that galvanizes a lot of attention, and they see that, and that is an encouragement. It feels like, like the solidarity that is expressed to you in that moment is real, and it is. But then what you also witness is, a few days later, the media cycle, goes on to the next thing, and then it also feels like everyone's attention dissipates with that. And so I think, if you are someone who's continuing to grieve and pay attention to crimes against Asians, then don't be afraid to just say that, like, tell your friends, I'm still seeing these things happen. Even the things that aren't like making the headlines. And I'm continuing to pray about it and to grieve about it. I think too, just like, even, initiative means so much. I think, instead of, taking on the posture of like, the posture of like, oh, I hope someone figures out what to do, or like, I hope someone figures out a way for us to respond to this. Like, I think the initiative of like, hey, like, you don't ask someone whose parents just died to like leave that funeral, like you allow that person to grieve by taking over that work yourself. And so I think sometimes in our churches, where there's, if something in the Black community happens, then we don't make our Black siblings in the church write the lament or plan how we're going to respond as a church. Like, you do that for them so that they can just tend to the work of grieving. And so I think that's one way that like a white Christian siblings can care for their siblings of color within the congregation, is like, if something happens to their community, like, why don't you take some initiative and you lead the congregation in a lament, so that that person and that community in our congregation can just do the work of grieving. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I really appreciate your question, Heather, because even for myself, I didn't quite know how to respond to people who, had experienced violence. I didn't know how to have the words or the questions to ask, and when all these, all this violence against Asian Americans have been escalating, it was my Black friends that came to me and asked me, how are you? How are you processing this? How are you processing this? Hey, or just, I just want you to know that, like, that was horrible what happened, and I stand with you, and I'm here for you, So I think even just that initiative, I think it's simple, and it really does mean a lot.
I appreciate both those points. And I was going to ask, just, I had this experience, especially with what's happened with, the Asian American, the shootings, and then the increase in violence, where I'm tracking with it, but I don't know what to say or ask. So I can Google search this, but since you're here, can you give me a shorthand, like 4 things I could say? Because I imagine I'm not the only one in that boat. And if you want me to Google it, I can do that. So just tell me.
Well, you can Google it. I'm happy to give some pointers here. The really great thing, a great thing about social media is that there are a lot of people you can follow these days who will kind of give some pointers about this. So you don't have to ask your friends. But I will say, one important rule I think to follow is just like, don't center yourself, center how they're doing, center their grief. That's what you're asking, right? Am I answering the right question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just, I, for whatever reason, with this particular violence, I just feel silent and I don't know what to say or ask.
Yeah.
So I personally would find even a short, because I do want to say something. I just don't know what to say other than,
Yeah.
hey, I see this and I don't know what to say. So if you have pointers, anything like that would be helpful, or
Yeah.
even what you were going to say.
Yeah. I think just the, reaching out to say, acknowledge what happened. Say, something like, again, like just center how they're doing. Like I said before, I think it can come across in a difficult way to say something like, oh, I just, I can't believe this, or to keep emphasizing like how horrified you are. So again, I think center their experience, acknowledge like this is not an isolated, part of the grief is this isn't an isolated thing. I want you to know that I'm just for you. I'm learning about this, and I won't, I'll show up in whatever ways that you need.
What you
I
said,
was so, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, what even just I'm learning about this, or like I don't think there's like you have to say these like 4 things. Even just being yourself and just be genuine. Like Amanda just said, just like I didn't even know what to think about this. Like and even that's fine, and just have a dialogue and help. We can process together. I think at the end of this for me, and just like, hey, did you see that? Like this guy that's just like shouted anti-Asian slurs and ran over a group of people in like Logan Square, and that's horrible. Like, and just like just having a dialogue about that. I think it's just that's helpful as well.
Thanks. I appreciate your help.
I think part of a reason why the initiative is so important is because for so long Asians were disregarded or felt invisible, didn't have a voice. So the act of just caring and just learning or just being aware of violence in America or elsewhere, I think that in itself does mean quite a lot.
There's
I think that message of I see you
Mhm.
is really powerful for, again, we're not a homogenous group, so I don't want to say most Asian Americans, but I do think because of like the context and the history, like that message of I see you is really powerful.
That's helpful.
If anyone has any questions, I mean, you can just say it, unmute yourself. And
Dr. Greener asked about Asian American theological insight that we would want the white church to hear and understand. I would, there's a lot, and actually the field of Asian American biblical hermeneutics is like a growing field. It's much bigger than it was 10 or 20 years ago, but it's again, because like we're fairly recently immigrated as a people group, like some of these things are pretty in development, right? In development enough where you now have some academic writing, but it hasn't really trickled down into like a lot of like popular level books, which is what I read, just to be clear. So, I think because of that immigrant experience, though, I think Asian Americans tend to read the Bible with that lens a little bit more. Like the nation of Israel, traveling out of Egypt and then being in exile, like I think those themes of being foreigners and being immigrants, that is near to the heart of God in the Old Testament, right? Like treat the foreigner among you in, with justice, because you yourselves were foreigners and immigrants, like I think that there's an insight into that experience that Asian Americans bring to the table. I think too, just the experience of extended family. I didn't share this, I kind of went into how isolating it felt growing up as Asian American in the Midwest. But I would say, you know, my favorite memories from childhood are when we visited my mother's side of the family, my Vietnamese side of the family. And for 2 weeks during the summer, it was like, you know, it was the smell of like fish sauce and garlic frying in the kitchen. And it was like the sound of all my aunties. And it was like laying with my uncles and aunties on the floor and hearing like Vietnamese fables being told until I fell asleep. And it was my aunts and uncles who also, you know, when they came to America, there was very, very high hostility against Vietnamese. Like people were actually very against receiving Vietnamese refugees. Now we tell it like, oh, it's part of the American story. But actually at the time, people were very hostile against the Vietnamese. So they would get phone calls, they would get threats over the phone from people who told them, you know, nobody wants you here. You need to leave. You need to go back home. They had a phone call where someone threatened to kill their dog. And then the next week, their dog disappeared. They were teased at school. They were, you know, just everything. Because of that, though, my uncles and aunts were very protective of us. And so whenever we visited them, they were the ones asking us, like, how are things at school? Are people teasing you? Do you know, what do you do when they do that? And they would kind of coach us about like how to defend ourselves, or, you know, or they just make us laugh about it. And for me, like those 2 weeks a year were the only place I felt like I belonged, where I felt protected and I felt seen and understood. And I felt understood and loved. And that for me is the experience I call to mind when I think of the church, like what the church should be. It's like a house full of aunties and uncles who are like, who know you and are looking out for you, who want to know how you're really doing. And I think that sense of family and aunties and uncles and cousins and things like that, that is like a tremendous gift to the church, especially because in America, the church is so, you know, single family unit driven. And I, you know, I see that intense pressure being put on families. Like parents are supposed to be able to do everything for their kids without the help of anyone in their community. And I think the church is like a vision that operates against that. It's like an alternative to that. And I think Asian Americans really can bring that to the church, and it informs the way that we read scripture as well.
Yeah, totally. Food and aunties. Alana said here, Alana in the chat says that even just acknowledging that you're thinking of Asian Americans, you know, your Asian American friends is helpful. It's a very true way.
You've
Yeah,
sorry, Juliet, you mentioned a few times about the physiological effects of trauma. I'm wondering if you know the book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah, that's a great book. Yeah.
It's one of the greatest books I've never read. It's really fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, no, I agree. It's definitely, and I think, you know, I have enough friends like at Life of the Vine who kind of do body work in therapy that I was familiar with a lot of the concepts, but it was, yeah, that book is really, really good. And then, you know, I'm trying to learn more about contemplative practices that engage your body. And I think that, you know, this is another like kind of maybe Western ideal, like post-enlightenment kind of thing, that like our faith is so cerebral and we've learned to really discount our emotions and our bodies, but how spirituality really needs to embrace all of them, and that we experience the spirit in our bodies first and foremost. So I'm learning more about that connection, and then how, you know, how that can play into healing from trauma. And I think that the church can learn a lot from like psychology and therapies right now, about how those things are connected.
Any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat.
So what comes next for you guys?
I am not sure yet. That's the short answer. I have ideas, but nothing concrete. I usually like to have something concrete. So y'all pray. Y'all pray that will, yeah. Jay is taking, our senior pastor is taking some sabbatical this summer. So it's partly a time to be fallow for a little while, I think, and let some of this sink in, and I think, our team has been talking some about just vision for this at Redeemer of what does it look like for us to be. I liked a racially reconciling community in our particular context. What is our vision for that? So I think that's some of but I think we've experienced a lot of water over the ground, and then so letting it sort of sink in and letting some stuff grow. That's kind of my image for us for right now. Yeah.
Is
Thanks,
there
Juliet.
one of my it's always hard to go somewhere and just like talk a bunch. So I'm just wondering, like, is there anything from you guys, like, as you have sat with this series, I assume many people on the call tonight attended some of the other things that Amanda organized, but what's sort of like rising to the surface for you, as I think you're kind of at the end of the series. So there's another thing I would love to do, but I don't have anybody to do it. So we might be at the end or one more, we'll see. But yes, ask away.
I think you were talking earlier about that white Christians can read the Bible and think this is the true way to read it. And the series has really helped me to see that there's many different ways to read the Bible, or just hear truth that are equally legitimate.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kelsey.
I mean, for me, one of the things that I'm constantly having to learn is how easy it is in these things to focus on the bad stuff, or like the problems or the deficits in, Black communities or Asian. What are the problems that need fixing? But instead of celebrating what's good and those who have been pioneers or who've, does that make sense? And so I feel like even in, even tonight, it's like we were celebrating you and Anthony. So I'm just finding myself having to constantly learn that and constantly learn to celebrate and not just be like, oh, look at all these problems. Like, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I've learned that a lot from like the Black community. And I think it was maybe Willie Jennings who said, like, anger and sadness, they come in and do their work. And they're necessary, but so they come in and they do their work, but then joy is what rebuilds. And I think that like joy and resiliency are often overlooked parts of justice work, but they're really the only things. Like, we can't just dismantle and tear down what's wrong. We have to eventually like move on to the work of like reimagining and rebuilding together.
Mm. Liz writes in the chat, one thing that has stood out to me is the different theological insights that non-white Christians have that I would never see, both the insights and the fact that we can and do see things differently, as Kelsey said, has been a gift. So I mean, I like that, even from the mosaic, right? It's like we all have different aspects that we, and different aspects of God that we see that we really gravitate towards, and what that we are in our lived experience, and being able to share that with each other is a gift. Bye, Suzanne.
Yes. I'm sensing that we're tired.
Thank
And
you
you
guys
probably
so
are,
much
Juliet,
for your hospitality.
Oh.
And we'll we'll be praying for you. Life in the Vine will be praying for you, and you guys can be praying for us as we, we're also doing this work and trying to learn. So we can be in prayer for each other as churches.
That sounds great.
Awesome.
All right.
All right,
Thanks,
thank you all.
everybody. Good to be with you all. Thank you, especially Juliet. And I'm going to email you for
Juliet.
your address in just a second. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.